Imagine a dark, silent night. The whole city is asleep, but in one house, the peaceful silence suddenly turns into pure terror. Flames burst out of the windows, enveloping the walls, devouring everything in their path. The house of a black woman becomes the victim of a criminal act set on fire by a man driven by hatred and racism. But what happened next? What consequences await the one who dared to take such a cruel step? Before we continue with this exciting story, let's get to know each other a bit. Write in the comments what your name is and where you're watching this video from. Believe us, it's incredibly important to us. Every comment, every response from you helps us promote our channel, making it stronger and more visible. Thanks to you, thousands of people will hear this story, and we will be able to talk more about justice and fighting hate. You are our support and inspiration. We appreciate you for being with us. For every like and comment, we are here for you and for you. Immerse yourself in this story, for now you will learn how justice catches up with someone who is willing to destroy another's life for the sake of hate. Enjoy the show. He lived in a small town where everyone knew each other, and where any actions quickly became public knowledge. In the local community, this man was known as a tough, reserved and, frankly, not the friendliest neighbor. The locals were used to his aloofness and strange looks, his constant complaining and perpetual discontent. But gradually, something more sinister appeared in his behavior, a tendency to open hatred, which soon began to erupt in his words and actions. The man did not hide his prejudiced views, which were becoming more and more radical with each passing year. There were already incidents in his life that could not but alarm others. For example, he often used hurtful language when talking about people of a different race. These words not only shocked, but also instilled fear in the neighbors, because his attitude seemed to them be in the control of ordinary moralizing. Any attempt to placate him only provoked more aggression. Over time, he was seen engaging in more violent and demeaning behaviors. On one occasion, when an African-American family had just moved in next door, he spoke openly about how they were strangers here, and that they were allegedly disrupting order. His hatred was not limited to mere words. He repeatedly did minor acts of vandalism against their property. For example, leaving crude messages and scrawled insults on the walls, sometimes throwing trash on their property, and defacing the mailbox. These antics went unpunished because he was never caught in the act, but the family understood who the threat was coming from. They lived in constant fear, trying not to show their fear or engage in conflicts with him. His anger and cruelty extended even to other people in the city who supported the new families or opposed discrimination. One of these people was his colleague, who tried to explain to him that the world had changed a long time ago and such views only lead to discord. This conversation ended and the man unleashed a torrent of rude and derogatory words at his colleague, calling him a traitor and a defender of those who were taking over their country. From that moment on, his opinion of right and wrong people became a rigid boundary, which he crossed more and more often, becoming less tolerant of those around him. His radical views began to grow into an obsession. He became involved in online communities that fueled his hatred, where he found like-minded people with whom he could share his dark thoughts. Surrounded by such people, he became convinced that his hatred was justified, and that acting against outsiders was supposedly a fight for justice. Those around him knew that he hated everyone he considered unworthy, and this hatred only grew. Year after year passed, and this hatred became habitual. People were afraid of him, trying to avoid him, to avoid contact with him. He, in turn, felt more and more confident, seeing that no one touched him. The man first met her on one of the usual days when he was returning home. On the quiet street where he had lived most of his life, he noticed a new neighbor, a black woman who had moved into the house across the street. She was young and friendly, saying hello to everyone she met, and was clearly enthusiastic about her new place of residence. This instantly irritated him. Her affability seemed to him something alien, out of place in what he considered to be a clean neighborhood in which, in his opinion, people of the wrong sort should not live. From the very beginning, he had an outright dislike for her. The man believed that people like him, outsiders and non-locals, had no right to occupy space in his neighborhood to disrupt the usual way of life. Her appearance, her friendly smile and carefree attitude infuriated him. He couldn't understand how she could behave like this, as if she owned everything here. as if she were his equal. His views on this were categorical and utterly cruel. She did not deserve to live among normal people. In his opinion, he soon noticed that his neighbor was not only polite, but actively engaged with other people, and even, to his horror, people reciprocated her. She quickly made friends among her neighbors, and sometimes small friendly gatherings could be seen on her property. This fact irritated him the most. It seemed to him that she was gaining sympathy, a place in the community, as if trying to feed into their world. She was occupying what he considered to be his exclusive territory, and she was also winning the approval of others. The first collision between them took place in a street parking lot. The man came home as usual, and when he saw her parked in the place where he used to park his car, he got angry. When they approached her, he stated that the spot was occupied, even though it did not officially belong to anyone. She responded with restraint, suggesting that he parked next to her, but he was not happy with that decision. He called her an intruder and said that people like her didn't deserve a place here or respect. His words sounded like a shocking insult, and no woman, though she tried not to be emotional, felt cold horror at his words. After that incident, his hatred for her began to take a dangerous turn. Every time he saw her on the street, when he noticed that someone was visiting her, or that she was just quietly going about her business, his anger boiled up inside him. It seemed to him that her every move was a challenge to him, that she was deliberately ignoring his dislike and neglecting his territory. His resentment reached such limits that he began to think about her almost constantly, obsessing about how he could let her know that she didn't belong with him. Soon he began to openly show his displeasure, putting his aggression on display. Every chance he got, he threw insulting remarks in her direction when she passed by. Neighbors sometimes tried to reason with him, but this only fueled his hatred and now considered them traitors, naive fools who supposedly didn't understand how she affected their community. To him, she was the embodiment of all these hateful beliefs about people from the wrong background. His hatred began to grow gradually into a compulsive desire to drive her out. He did not want to see her, did not want to tolerate her presence, and was willing to do anything to get rid of this woman. Thoughts began to swarm in his head that he had to do something more to get rid of her for good, to make her feel his power and realize that she didn't belong here. At first it was small things. Whenever a woman passed his house, he looked at her with contempt, glaring at her with a glare full of malice. Every time she met his gaze, she felt uneasy. His eyes expressed a fierce contempt that hid a threat. She tried to ignore him, hoping that his resentment would subside with time, but it only got worse. One of his first overt acts of aggression were the words he threw at her when she was cleaning up her allotment one day. She was sweeping up leaves, and at one point he stepped closer and said icily, "Why are you cleaning up? This earth doesn't belong to you anyway. You shouldn't be here." She felt fear brewing inside her. His words sounded with cold certainty, like a warning that she was a stranger here and would never be accepted. His threats began to gain momentum. Soon there were offensive writings scrawled in paint on her door. Every morning, she left the house to see new vile messages in large letters, urging her to get out of the neighborhood. It seemed to her that eventually it should stop, that he would eventually leave her alone. But the hatred and aggression only grew. She could feel his every word, every offensive inscription seeping into her life, turning ordinary days into a nightmare. One morning when she left the house, she found her mailbox mangled and covered in some dark, sticky liquid. She went to the police, but the police had no evidence to accuse anyone in particular. All she could do was endure and try to ignore it, but it was getting harder and harder. Almost every day, he found new ways to remind her that, in his opinion, she was just an unwanted guest. After a while, the man began to do more damage. Her car, parked outside her house, turned out to be splattered with paint. She found scratches all over the body and a broken side mirror. It seemed to her that all this was happening endlessly and no one could protect her. The man felt impunity and, moreover, power. He liked to see her afraid. He enjoyed watching his aggression leave a trace in her life, destroying her peace of mind. Fear settled inside her like an intruder. She was afraid to leave the house late at night because she felt that he might be waiting for her somewhere nearby. Every sound outside the window, every random rustle made her flinch. She felt like he was watching her even when he wasn't visible. His presence seemed to envelop her home, making every day a challenge. He knew what he was doing and enjoyed destroying her confidence, slowly and cruelly subjugating her to his intentions. Then the notes began to arrive. Slips of paper with short but intimidating messages appeared under the door or on the windshield of the car. In them, he wrote that she should get out or that she didn't belong here. The messages weren't overly threatening, but they felt like hateful warnings. She knew his intentions were growing darker and more dangerous. Her heart sank each time she found another note. It seemed to her that these notes were like a stigma, like proof that she was not a person in his eyes, but only an object of hatred that he longed to break. Fear gradually took over her life. She began to wake up at night in alarm, turning around at every rustle, afraid to see him standing at the window or outside the house. Her whole reality became a constant expectation of another act of aggression. She felt that he would do something much worse, that the boundaries of his cruelty were blurring. The man saw her growing fear, and it drove him to new, more and more violent actions. So, day after day, he turned her life into a nightmare, coldly and methodically destroying her sense of security, her own, her confidence in the future. Over time, his hatred turned into an obsession. He could no longer think about anything but the fact that she had, in his opinion, defiled his neighborhood. Every morning, seeing her leave the house, seeing her greet her neighbors, his anger and irritation boiled up inside. It seemed to him that she was literally mocking him, disregarding his right to claim this land, and nothing could quell his anger. Her presence was becoming unbearable to him, and he was beginning to see her as a threat to be rid of at all costs. This inner fracture occurred after one particular encounter. One day, he saw a woman walking quietly past his house and having a nice conversation with one of his old acquaintances. It was an elderly man who had lived in the neighborhood for many years, and with whom he had previously shared his thoughts without encountering resistance. Now this man seemed to have accepted her, welcomed her as part of their community. The man couldn't bear the sight, couldn't understand how others could accept someone he considered a stranger. It was as if this scene had broken something inside him. He realized that he could no longer tolerate her presence, that his measure's words, threats, petty acts of vandalism had no power if she still lived here, near him. If others accepted her against his will, his hatred had reached a boiling point, turning into an irreversible desire for revenge, a desire not just to frighten her, but to erase her presence forever. He decided that this time he would make sure she never came back to this house again. He needed to do something serious, something that would get her out of here once and for all. The thought of setting the house on fire came to him, an act he saw as a logical, almost just retribution. In his mind, this decision became a mission, an act of cleansing. He knew that arson would cut her out of his life forever, and he imagined how the flames would destroy every trace of her, how fear and terror would engulf her, force her to leave the place, leaving him alone with victory. Day after day, he hashed the plan, imagining the flames engulfing the walls of the house, her watching the destruction, and finally realizing that she didn't belong here. He could almost hear her screams, see the consternation in her eyes, and find a grim satisfaction in it. His hatred had grown into such an intense desire to hurt that he didn't care what followed. He wanted only one thing, to feel power and control over her fate, to complete his plan. The plan was simple. He would set the house on fire at night when no one could stop him. He would start by spraying the walls with flammable liquid, let the flames burn, and then walk away, knowing that his work was done. The arson, in his mind, was the culmination of all the hatred he had been building up, the injustice it was writing for him. It was not just a crime, it was an act of just retribution, and no voice of reason could stop him. He decided that the plan had to be flawless. The arson required careful preparation. Every step, every moment had to be calibrated so that nothing would interface with his plan. In his head, he replayed the night ahead repeatedly, imagining how it would go, from the first drops of flammable liquid soaking into the walls to the flames that would engulf the entire house, destroying everything she had brought to the neighborhood. The first thing he did was to look for materials. The man went to a nearby town to buy gasoline cans and sets of matches. He chose a store farther away from home, trying not to attract attention. Even to the salesman, he answered briefly, giving no sign of his intentions, hiding his emotions under a calm mask. The whole process brought him a strange sense of satisfaction, the realization that with each step he was getting closer to fulfilling his plan. Back home, he hid the canisters in the basement, away from prying eyes. While he waited for the right moment, he checked the contents, sometimes even tried lighting matches watching the brief, acrid flame flare up and imagining how that small flame would soon grow into a devastating fire. At those moments, it seemed to him that he held her fate in his hands, that just one flick of a match could change everything. The next step was to work out the details of the plan. He decided that the arson should take place late at night, when everyone was asleep and the streets were deserted. Watching the neighborhood from his window, he studied the habits of the neighbors, their bedtime, so that he would know exactly when the whole area would be quiet. He knew the schedule of their lives down to the last detail. When the lights went out at the next house, when the last car left the street, his powers of observation had become almost painful these days to every slightest noise outside the window or movement in the yard. He took in with a keen eye for the exact moment to act. The man realized that he would have to disguise himself so that no one would recognize him. He prepared dark clothes, an old hooded jacket and heavy boots that would not attract attention. Under the cover of night, he was going to sneak out to his victim's house, lurking in the shadows so no one would notice his presence. He'd even worked out an escape route, thinking carefully about how he would leave the scene without leaving a trace. In the last days before the crime, he had hardly slept at all, lying in the dark and imagining how everything would happen. His thoughts were torn between a sense of power and brutal determination. Every time he remembered the moments when he thought she had violated his space, a wave of hatred rose up inside, spurring him to carry out his plan. He was sure that he was doing the right thing, that this night would put an end to all his suffering and hatred. All the preparations were completed, and all that remained was to wait for the right night. The man felt grimly calm. He was absolutely certain that he would escape justice. There was no fear of exposure in his mind, only the certainty of his righteousness and the anticipation of revenge which he had long cherished in his mind. This night seemed quieter than usual. The dark, starless sky hung over the city like a gloomy blanket, absorbing all sounds and hiding the streets under its endless shadows. The man stood at the window, waiting for the right moment. It seemed to him that every second was like a drumbeat bursting inside. His heart beat deafeningly, like the eve of an event he had been planning for so long. There were no doubts in his mind, only stern determination. Everything ahead was prepared down to the smallest detail. He threw on an old hooded jacket, the dark cloth covering his face. He took the gasoline cans, which he had filled to the brim beforehand, and chose a moment when the whole house was quiet. Falling into a deep night's sleep, cautiously he stepped out into the street and moved toward the woman's house, trying to move noiselessly. His footsteps were absorbed by the soft ground, and the darkness completely concealed his figure. The street was empty, and no lights were on in any window. Everyone was asleep, unsuspecting. As he approached the house, he lurked behind the bushes, listening for sounds inside. Only silence. The man grinned to himself, feeling a sense of superiority overpowering him, as if the night itself had blessed him for this endeavor. Picking up the canister, he began methodically pouring gasoline around the house. He moved confidently, step by step, covering every corner, every nook and cranny with the flammable liquid. The smell of gasoline cut the air, enveloping it in an acrid plume. It seemed to him as if he were writing his own story of revenge, each stroke of the canister turning into another paragraph of his cruel justice. The smell of burning wood and gasoline mixed with smoke filled his lungs. The man felt as if the fire were cleansing his soul, burning away everything that made him hate him and leaving only emptiness. He watched as the flames engulfed the roof, collapsing it inward, as the fire engulfed the windows, shattering the glass, sending shards of glass flying across the grass. His face remained still, but an ominous satisfaction raged inside him. He believed that this retribution was just, that he had finally proved his superiority to her, put her in her place. The flames roared, flooding the dark street with an ominous, shivering light. The screams and panic of the neighbors, who began to run out of their houses, broke the silence, but he didn't listen to them. Without turning around, the man vanished like a shadow into the night, leaving behind only the blazing fire that was his revenge, his decision, and what he thought would be his final triumph. When the first rays of sunlight illuminated the street, the house was a charred shell, black soot stains, collapsed roofs, burnt windows, nothing left of the once cozy and bright house, but embers and smoke still rising above the ruins. It smelled of burning and loss, as if the earth itself was soaked with it. The woman was sitting on the curb, wrapped in a woolen blanket her neighbors had brought her. Her face was expressionless, her eyes clouded, as if she were still inside that fiery nightmare, trapped in her fears. Her ears were still filled with echoes of the nightmare that had erupted during the night. How she had woken up and smelled the smell of burning. How she had rushed to the door, gasping for breath, hearing the fire taking over everything around her. Her house, which had been a symbol of a new beginning, a new life, was now ashes. With every glance at the charred ruins, terrible memories came back. She saw pictures of the flames devouring her furniture, wallpaper, photographs that held the most important moments of her life. Her personal belongings that carried such significance to her were reduced to black rubble, irretrievably lost. These were not just possessions, they were pieces of her memory, pieces of herself. The fire had taken not only her material possessions, but also a part of her soul. But what was even worse was the realization that it had all been done on purpose. She saw the frightened faces of the neighbors around her, heard the whispers, felt their compassion, but knew that nothing would bring back her lost sense of security. She realized that someone with whom she shared a street, a life, hated her enough to dare such a brutal act, without thinking that he could kill her or any of the other residents of the house. Agonizing questions swarmed in her mind. Who could have hated her so much? Why, she couldn't believe that someone would do such a thing for blind hatred. The psychological trauma became an unbearable burden for her. After the fire, she could not sleep, waking up at the slightest sound, thinking that the fire had engulfed her again. Images of flames haunted her every time she closed her eyes, turning a peaceful sleep into a nightmare. She was afraid to go outside, to meet the gaze of the people among whom the man who had done this might be found. This man had robbed her not only of her home, but also of her sense of security, of confidence in the future. His every action, from planning to arson, had been done with one goal in mind: to hurt her, to erase her life in this place. And he had accomplished that. Anxiety became a constant companion in her life. She felt trapped in walls of fear and helplessness, as if cut off from the world. Every movement seemed dangerous to her. Every sound made her freeze with terror. She found it hard to believe that this nightmare would ever end, that she could feel safe again. The loss of her home was not just a financial blow, but also a blow to her faith in people. Injustice. It seemed to her that her life, her hopes, her dreams, everything she had worked for and tried to build was destroyed overnight. The morning brought not only light, but also a sense of ominous unease that hung over the entire neighborhood. News of the arson quickly spread through the neighborhood, and neighbors began to arrive at the scene one by one, stunned by the sight of the charred ruins. Many could not believe their eyes, for this tragedy seemed to have destroyed their way of life. They stood stunned at the sight of the destroyed house, realizing that the crime had been committed by someone in their own community. The shock of the incident overwhelmed them. The whole neighborhood seemed to be gripped by an invisible threat. Cold and cruel, people spoke in whispers, their faces expressing horror and bewilderment. How could something like this have happened? Who among them was capable of such merciless cruelty? The familiar smiles of their neighbors, the morning greetings and friendly glances now seemed deceptive, hiding something dark. The atmosphere was saturated with fear and suspicion. People looked at each other anxiously. Each of them could be a hidden enemy. For many, the thought of a person capable of such a thing living among them was unbearable. This arson was an act of horrific cruelty that shattered their sense of security. If the house that had been a woman's refuge was destroyed in such a barbaric manner, then none of them were immune to a similar fate. The usual morning routines, a morning walk, a conversation with a neighbor, were now a source of apprehension and wariness. Everyone began to suspect that this act might not be a single one. That evil might strike again. But this fear also sparked something else in people, a determination not to be indifferent. When many people saw the woman, their neighbor, sitting in the charred ruins of her house, they felt they could not just stand by. One by one, they began to approach her, trying to support her, expressing words of sympathy and anger for the one who had done such a thing. They began to offer help, food, lodging. Some organized fundraisers to rebuild her home as soon as possible. Despite their shared horror, they realized that they could not let cruelty and hatred win. The neighbors also decided that they needed to unite against this evil that had infiltrated their lives. They needed to show that there was no place in their community for those who destroy other people's lives, for the sake of hatred and prejudice. People started talking about not letting fear and hatred take over their streets. They decided to hold night vigils to prevent further acts of violence, uniting against the lurking threat that was now in the air. This crime changed their perception of their neighborhood forever. Now every window, every quiet courtyard seemed to conceal a threat, and peaceful life was suddenly an illusion. But they also realized that if they stayed united, they could overcome this fear. Through their unity, they wanted to show that they would not let brutality destroy their lives and would not leave those who were affected without support. When local law enforcement arrived at the scene of the fire, they immediately sensed the tension that enveloped the street. The charred walls, soot marks, and the smell of burning wood clearly indicated that what had happened was not just an accident, but a deliberate arson. The police officers scrutinized the scene, stepping carefully over the charred debris, looking for even the slightest clues that might lead them to the culprit. The first thing they did was to photograph the scene and collect evidence. The investigator leaned over the dark stains on the ground left by the gasoline and could tell from the acrid smell that it had been arson. The remains of the canister, or at least scraps of burned footprints, might have given them clues, but it was all hidden under a layer of ash and soot. The investigation was slow at first, and there seemed little chance of solving the case. The sheer amount of charred debris and objects distorted by the fire made it difficult to work, turning every step into an agonizing search. The police began questioning witnesses' neighbors who might have seen or heard something on the night of the fire. However, most of them woke up only when the fire had already engulfed the house and did not see the fire start. They only shared fears and assumptions, many of which were far from reality. But one witness, an elderly man, recalled that late at night, shortly before the fire started, he noticed a dark figure slipping along the street. That observation was a blur, but it gave investigators a hint that the arson was a carefully planned act. Investigators also began checking nearby surveillance cameras. Although the cameras did not capture the moment of the arson, some of the footage showed a man in dark clothing moving towards the house, trying to stay in the shadows. His face was hidden and it was not possible to see him, but the fact that the unknown figure was present that night convinced the police that they were on the right track. Next, the police conducted an examination of the gasoline found at the crime scene. They tried to determine its composition and origin, believing that this might lead them to the store where the flammable liquid had been purchased. After several days of painstaking work, they were able to find a match to a particular type of gasoline sold at a store in a neighboring town. After reviewing the court footage of that store, they spotted a man buying several cans of gasoline shortly before the arson. This was an important clue, but his face remained covered, and this was not enough to make an accurate identification. They began matching shopping times with the man's movement on cameras throughout the neighborhood. These details gradually added up to a mosaic that helped police determine the approximate route the suspect took to it from the arson scene. At the same time, investigators were checking the woman's connections with local residents to see if anyone had a personal motive for the attack. In the course of questioning and analyzing contacts, police noticed a man who had previously been aggressive and openly hostile towards the woman. Neighbors said that the man had long been known for his racist views and had repeatedly shown hostility towards her. His name came up more and more often in conversations, and after a few more interrogations, the police finally determined that the motive for the crime was more than obvious. They now had enough reason to call him in for questioning. The evidence, details and witness statements gathered allowed investigators to draw conclusions and move forward to arrest the suspect. When the police, having gathered enough evidence and witness statements, obtained an arrest warrant, they went to the suspect's house. The neighborhood was tense, and news that the investigation was closer to a solution spread rapidly. Many neighbors, gripped by fear and outrage, already knew who was at the center of suspicion and now awaited law enforcement action, hungry for justice. The police arrived at the man's house in the early morning hours, surrounding the property to prevent his escape. There was a knock at the door, and he opened it, keeping a look of haughty calm on his face, although there was a slight look of confusion in his eyes when it was announced to him that he had been arrested on suspicion of arson. The man's face turned pale. He lost control for a moment, but then quickly pulled himself together, trying to keep his composure. When asked about his motives, he discreetly denied his involvement, claiming that it was a misunderstanding and that he had allegedly had nothing to do with the arson. He tried to speak calmly, confidently, trying to instill doubt in the police officers, insinuating that he was only being accused because of rumors and bias. "It's just someone's speculation," he said, looking at the officers with a challenging look. "Someone wants to blame me for someone else's problems." However, the police, with irrefutable evidence, did not give in to his attempts to justify himself. Surveillance footage was found on him, confirming that he had been in the vicinity of the crime scene on the night of the arson, and fuel tests matched the gasoline he had purchased. The investigators told him in detail about the evidence they had collected, and the man's face stretched, his confidence shaken. He realized that he would not be able to get away with it so easily. Realizing that the evidence against him was serious, he began to change tactics, trying to present the incident as an accident or misunderstanding. He put forward the version that he was just passing by and had no malicious intent. However, his excuses sounded unconvincing, and that investigators continued to ask him questions, pressuring him, showing that they knew much more than he thought. At this time, public pressure was mounting. The neighbors, shocked by what had happened, demanded justice. Everyone knew the danger the woman was in, and they all wanted the perpetrator to be punished fairly. There was a deep sense of outrage and a desire for justice in the city. People began to gather outside the police station, expressing support for the victim and demanding that the perpetrator be punished. Realizing that he would not be able to escape the court of public opinion, the man began to try to justify his actions, saying that it did not intend to hurt anyone, that it was just an act of protest, that he did not want things to go that far. However, each of his excuses only exacerbated the situation, made people even angrier, and only emphasized his indifference to the consequences of his actions. Now that formal charges had been brought against him, the man realized that justice could not be avoided. Public pressure and undeniable evidence turned his attempts to justify himself into empty words that could not deceive anyone. When the trial began, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense and saturated with anticipation of justice. The press, neighbors, activists, and friends of the injured woman gathered to witness the proceedings. Their faces expressed anger and anticipation that the court would deliver a harsh verdict. As the judge began the hearing, he emphasized that this case was not just an act of vandalism, but a hate crime, that had shaken and disrupted the community. The prosecutor began with the accusatory speech, describing the events of that fateful night and clearly presenting to the court the motives of the accused. He presented the evidence gathered by the investigation, camera footage showing the suspect in the vicinity of the house on the night of the arson, the results of a fuel test that matched a flammable liquid purchased by the man in a neighboring town, and witnesses who testified to his hostility and racist remarks against the victim. The prosecutor noted that the crime was not just an outburst of anger, but a carefully planned act of aggression aimed at intimidation and humiliation. Witnesses called to court described the man's behavior prior to the arson, his threats, aggression, and racist remarks. They described how he was openly contemptuous of his neighbor, making caustic remarks and vandalizing her property. One neighbor recalled how the man bluntly stated that people like her shouldn't live here, and he said this with contempt, making no secret of his hatred. Each piece of evidence established that the defendant harbored a deep animosity toward the woman because of her race. When the defendant was given the floor, he tried to justify himself, claiming that his intentions were not that serious. He said that he didn't want to kill anyone, that he didn't think it would turn out this way. His words sounded unconvincing and unemotional, like empty attempts to avoid responsibility. The prosecution emphasized that such excuses only demonstrated his complete indifference to the consequences of his actions, and that he was only aggravating his guilt by not recognizing the gravity of what he had done. The defense tried to appeal to his past, presenting him as a person who had difficult life circumstances, but the judge stopped his attempts, stressing that personal difficulties cannot justify an act of violence and hatred. The public was outraged to the extreme. Everyone in the room understood that the man deserved to be punished, and there was no doubt in anyone's mind that what had happened was an act of extreme cruelty and deliberate aggression. When it came time to pronounce the sentence, the judge spoke firmly and without a shadow of doubt in his voice. He began by saying that such hate crimes pose a huge threat to society, undermining security and stability. The judge emphasized that the defendant's actions were aimed at humiliation and destruction, at causing not only material but also deep emotional damage. You attempted to destroy another person's life based on hatred and prejudice, the judge said, his voice sounding like a verdict for all those who saw in such crimes the right to impunity. The judge found the man guilty of premeditated arson motivated by hate and emphasized that society would not tolerate such acts. He was given a long prison term as punishment, with a heavy fine to cover the damage to the woman. The judge's strong and harsh words were a final reminder to all present that justice will be meted out to those who try to act out of hatred and prejudice. The entire hall was silent in suspense as the judge finished announcing the verdict. For many, this moment was a catharsis, a long-awaited justice. The man, realizing the gravity of the sentence, lost the remnants of his confidence. He realized that he would no longer be able to escape punishment, that his hatred and anger would now lead him to a place where they could no longer hurt others. This tragic story reverberated deeply in the hearts of not only the people of the small town, but also those who heard about it outside the town. The flames that erupted that night, destroying the woman's home, left not only charred ruins, but also a deep scar on the consciousness of the entire community. Faced with such horror, people realized the destructive power of hatred and intolerance. It seemed that this act of cruelty and malice should have broken people, but on the contrary, it united them and showed them how important it is for all to stand together against such acts of evil. Residents realized that resentment, prejudice, and a refusal to recognize differences can have terrible consequences. A sense of horror in the face of such evil was replaced by a determination to protect each other. The story was a clear lesson that if aggression and hatred are not stopped at the root, it can turn into something monstrous. What happened reminded everyone of the importance of condemning and confronting injustice, whether in words or actions, and preventing it from creeping into society. For the affected woman, this support was a real salvation. After the tragedy, many people helped her get back to normal life. Some provided her with housing, some helped her raise funds to rebuild her house, and some were just there to listen and support her in difficult moments. She felt that the people around her were not just neighbors, but true allies, ready to fight for justice and protect her from evil. Their unity in a difficult moment showed that even in the face of tragedy, people can stand up for each other. Over time, this story has become a reminder to everyone of the need to eradicate prejudice and hatred without letting it become deeply rooted in society. People learned that hate is destructive not only to those who fall victim to it, but also to all those around them and to society as a whole. This history has taught them that security, justice, and unity are shared values that require constant attention and effort from everyone. This incident will be remembered by the community as a bitter reminder that each of us has a responsibility to ensure that something like this does not happen again. If this story has touched you, share your opinion in the comments. How do you feel about what happened? Have you experienced or seen racism in your life? Your experiences and opinions are very important to us. We value each and every one of you and always welcome your feedback. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. And give us a like if you support the fight against injustice. Thank you for being with us, and we wish you a good day filled with warmth and kindness.